the public. Yeah. Any questions about these logistics? No? All right, next. So the one for, I think this varies in different meetings, but our request is that you use the chat. And I know some people are asking questions here, and I saw there was a question about whether someone is officially part of the work group or not. And Jim, I'm not sure how to answer that question. Perhaps you do have the answer. I don't.
Yes, if people can, so members of the planning group who self-nominate are members of the working group. So we have a roster that we have kept. Yeah, just direct message me if you have a question about that.
Okay.
And they're also, yes, and one other thing there, as is discussed in the charter and at planning group meetings, if you are invited by a planning group member as a expert or sort of other relevant party, then you can be on the roster as well. But flows through the planning group.
Everything flows through the planning group. Okay. That's the best clue I can offer if you're curious about your status. We are asking that you use the chat for technical assistance so that we don't have a secondary conversation going on. And that way we can look at the chat if people are having technical difficulties and use it to do our best to address those. Okay, next. That will bring us to our first agenda item, and that is clarifying or just confirming work group membership roles and responsibilities. And this just picks up on the comment that Jim offered a minute ago. If we go into the few bullet points, and that is that everything in terms of membership on the working group flows from the planning group. So this first bullet is the pool. And as I said, some portions of the meetings are open to the public. Some will be closed. We don't have a regular meeting schedule. I don't think yet, Jim, do we? But that's certainly something that we'll want to be thinking about as we think about deliverables, work products, and timing.
That's correct. We'll talk about the frequency of meetings later on today.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the expectation is, though, that people are willing to participate regularly in this work group as well as in others. And as you can see here, the working groups are identifying co-leads, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that role entails, or co-chairs. So just if this is the basic concept here in terms of participation. Are there any questions that anyone has? I think there's a request to admit Tom Johnson to the meeting, so maybe we can do that. Any questions? No? Okay, then let's move to the next slide. We can talk a little bit about the purpose for the planning group and how this all holds together. This will be familiar to most of you. So, we want to show how the work group fits together with the planning group's purpose. So if we go to the next slide, for this working group, the intention is that those of you participating are going to bring your local expertise and knowledge of the two basins, as well as of the Potter Valley project, and also the related water rights and water management issues to inform the water forums planning process. We had a good discussion last time about potential work products to support the water forum process that would focus on water rights and water management issues. And that's what the planning group is looking to you for as far as input and feedback. Welcome to this particular set of tasks to assist the planning group. I think that unless there are questions on this general role and responsibilities, what I want to do is have Jim give you a quick update on or a recap on the water rights and also the technical briefing, and then the relevant planning group discussions to frame up our discussion of what you think is needed. And we'll get into that, after this next framing conversation. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, this is just to review some of the discussion items from the planning for the technical briefings that were held back in June, as well as the planning group discussions that we've had for the first 3 meetings of that body. And just as a reminder, the slides, the water rights overview that Ryan Becerra presented at the Water Rights and Water Management briefing back in June, as well as meeting recordings and summaries, are all on the Russian River Water Forum website, which is at that URL shown on your screen there. So at the Water Rights and Water Management technical briefing, we reviewed a number of topics as shown here: the categories of water rights in the Russian River, rights to what's known as abandoned water from the Potter Valley Project, rights to water stored in Lake Mendocino and the various complexities of that, including the 10,000 acre-foot per year reservation, potential effects of changes to the Potter Valley Project on those rights, and then also water rights in the Eel River Basin broadly, as well as we had a particular discussion on the federal Indian reserved water rights and the Round Valley Tribes water and fishing rights in particular. And we had at the, then this is a recap of the resiliency discussion that we had at the most recent planning group meeting, which was back in July. There was a discussion. We had presentations from a number of municipal and agricultural water providers and water interests, and the conclusion of that discussion was that there are many measures that have been implemented and will continue to be implemented to reduce water demand and increase resiliency. And also part of that discussion was that in the near term, this has been presented a number of times, the eliminating the Potter Valley Project diversion in the near term would result in curtailments and Lake Mendocino draining in 2 of 10 years. But in the longer term, as these investments in resiliency continue, there's the potential for reducing or eliminating the need for the diversion. We've also,
Jim,
yeah,
could I just interrupt? I'm getting some background noise. Could I ask everyone to?
Yeah, that may be on that. Possible.
That's better. Okay.
Sorry about that.
We have to police ourselves, don't we?
Indeed, yeah. Sorry, this is the return to office complexities. Let's see. So yes, just to review what's been covered several times, that the 2 basin partnership evaluated multiple scenarios for the future of the Potter Valley Project, and the preferred alternative included the following: the removal of Scott Dam, improved fish passage at Cape Horn Dam, and see next slide for some more nuance on that, as well as the continued Potter Valley Project diversion. So just recapping what that effort put forward. And then, as was discussed at the Water Supply and Fisheries technical briefing and at that working group meeting last week, there are 3 alternatives for improved fish passage at Cape Horn Dam that are currently being assessed as part of the DWR funded study. It's the same DWR grant that kicked off this water forum process. And those alternatives are a new fish ladder and then 2 dam removal alternatives, one with the pump station and one with the rough-in channel. So those are the alternatives that are moving forward at this point. And then just to review some of the information needs that have been raised in these multiple discussions, which I've just mentioned. So one is a need for, at least, this is a potential work product of this group, would be a joint memo on water rights issues, summarizing the facts that aren't in dispute. Another is documentation of Washington River water rights. A water budget has been mentioned as something that would be useful to support this overall process going forward, documentation of the water available and the water used, and data gaps in that. More complete information on tribal water rights in both basins, and more information on the relevant federal reserve water rights was also a topic that came up in the technical briefing. So that is it for just a summary again of the discussion items that have come up in those past meetings. Apologies again for the background noise here. And now, Mike, back to you for moving into discussion.
Okay, so I know we've been moving pretty quickly, but I felt like unless there are questions, I'm assuming that you all are comfortable with what you're seeing, that it's much of it's familiar to you, either as planning group members and from participating in the technical briefings, and also in the previous efforts. But if you have questions at this point about anything that you have seen or heard in these few preliminary items, please raise your hand and we can talk it through. Otherwise, I wanted to get into, okay, Walter Collins.
Hey, yeah, sorry, this is Reggie Collins.
Oh, it's Reggie, yes.
But
okay.
I went with my legal name for my Zoom login apparently. So.
Your parents will be happy.
I know, seriously. I'll tell them later today. But yeah, I'm with CalTrout, and I just wanted to flag that on those information needs element, we luckily have, we luckily have memos done kind of ad nauseum on those subjects. And so it should be pretty easy information and collect and processing if we did want to create your own, objective memo. I think the memos by Ryan Becerra, by Round Valley, by CalTrout, and by Sonoma Water on like the collective water rights holdings. I just happened to look through them in the last, really yesterday. They all have the same exact information. They're pretty objective. And so compiling those will be pretty easy. And then if Round Valley is comfortable, I believe they have some type of analysis on their water rights that you may be able to cajole out of them as well. And so just wanted to note that those information needs are not new work. And so if you want to work with those folks that have produced them, I think you could get them relatively quickly.
Great. And actually, we may be looping back to you, Reggie, as someone who would be part of a working group that would take on that task if that is the direction that the working group makes sense. I mean, that's kind of a taking advantage of what you've got. And it sounds pretty efficient. So I appreciate you pointing that out to start, because it will help focus our conversation.
Sounds good.
Any other questions or input at this point? I want to get into some of these specific questions. No? Oh, Janet, is that right? Yeah, Polly?
Yes, hi, thanks. Just one quick comment. I think that on one of the slides you suggested that in the future the Potter Valley diversion may not be needed if there can be changes made with regards to resiliency, storage, etc. on the Russian River side. I don't remember that. I remember that perhaps somebody suggested that. I don't remember that being a generally accepted result moving forward, because I think the reason that I'm concerned about it is that we have a long way to go before we could realize such a change, and particularly with Potter Valley itself, who is above the storage at Lake Mendocino. So we're talking about some major infrastructure projects that we are working on right now. And we're talking about engineering those, getting permits for them, and funding those efforts. And that's going to take a very long time. I just didn't want people to have the impression that that was something that was going to be happening anywhere in the near future, that our need for that diversion would be eliminated. Just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Yeah, and Janet, thank you actually for setting up my next slide. It's because you are out ahead and obviously it's important to you. And why don't we just look at that next slide, Jim? And I would ask both Reggie and Janet, if you can lower your hands, just hit the raise hands again, your hand will go away. So in order to discuss these options and discuss water rights, what you've pointed to, Janet, is that an assumed scenario is needed, and the way you navigate to this or a way to have a conversation will be up to you. But the question is, what is being assumed? Okay, the proposal is that the working group proceeds under the assumption that a diversion will continue in some form under the ownership of a new regional entity. That's a proposal to this group to allow you to do your work and provide input to the forum. But I wanted to test this. So Janet, again, thanks for setting that up. So is this a discussion that the work group would like to have about this assumption? Because, how does that suggestion land with you? I see Vivian, your hand is up, so let's start with you.
So at the last meeting of Water Supply and Fisheries, it was talked about that, we're looking to have a functioning ecosystem on the eel. We don't know what the costs and liabilities are of owning a diversion, of someone owning, an entity owning the diversion. We don't have that information yet. And we don't know what the definition of surplus water is. So we don't know how cost effective it will be for a diversion to be engineered with proper fish accommodation and the eel, and whether that will be a viable option, actually.
Right.
We're not opposed to it if there's water that can be used without harming the eel. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. I want to make sure I see David, your hand is up and Matt's hand is up. I didn't get the order, so
I think David was first.
okay.
So it's my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that, pardon me, the amount of water diverted is below 2% of the eel flow. And that's certainly, it's not zero, but it's not a large proportion. Again, that may be incorrect data, but I believe it's below 2%. Representing the water users, the residential water users of the upper Russian River Valley, the diversion is really essential for us to avoid water rationing. All of this is going to be costly, and it's not all clear where the funds will come from for any of this work. Anything we talk about, the funding is not established, but both for agriculture and for residential, that diversion is pretty essential to our continuing.
Thanks, David. Okay, who's next? Is it Matt?
Yeah, I think so. This is Matt Clifford with Trout Unlimited. I'm a working group member. Can you help me understand the thinking behind the first bullet? I mean, I think I agree in principle. In order to analyze this, we need to have some assumptions and some scenarios, but it's not clear to me why we would limit ourselves to just one scenario. And as I see it, as I look at events, one scenario is that we could have a continued diversion with the regional entity, et cetera. And I think a lot of us are interested in working towards that. But I also think that's a lot of things that are going to have to come together. A lot of moving parts there, and particularly in a limited time. And we don't know if that's going to happen or not. I mean, we can try and work as hard as we can and try to make it happen, but a real possibility is that doesn't happen in time. And we at least have, in the short term or the long term, a period without a diversion. It seems like it would be pretty incumbent upon us to plan for that scenario as well. So, I mean, are we precluding the idea of multiple scenarios here? Because it just seems like that would be the wise thing to do to me.
Well, the intention of this slide was to provoke just this conversation, right? And thinking
Sure.
about timelines, work products, and really what you all think is going to best help the forum, including the planning group, be informed about the water rights components of whatever would be considered. So, you know, if a proposal is well, yes, some sort of assumption about a diversion in some form, that, you know, that scenario, yes, we get it. We ought to, you know, talk about what the water rights and water management issues are. And another scenario as well, I mean, that's up for conversation. And I appreciate you pointing that out. We do want to make sure that everyone, that you have a workable scenario or scenarios, right? Otherwise, because you don't want an untethered water rights discussion. That's not what you're trying to do here. Okay, let's see. Who is next? I see Reggie's hand up and Jeannie's hands up. Oh, is Clifford also? So I think that you were first.
Yeah,
So
I think Cliff is first.
Cliff, and then Reggie, then Jeannie. Is that right?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay.
I guess I just wanted to echo Matt's sentiment that I don't think that a single assumed scenario is going to serve us very well. And I also am just curious, given that this particular working group is sort of analyzing and discerning how it is that we meet the water rights needs of the Russian River users, while obviously thinking about the impact on the Eel River watershed, is sort of the direction of approach. You know, do we want to come up with a scenario and then see what that impact is on water rights users, or do we want to look at what the water rights are and sort of base at least one of our scenarios based on being able to meet those needs in the short, medium, and long term? So I guess I would advocate for probably multiple scenarios, and for us to proceed from, you know, what is it needed to meet the needs of both private, tribal, and governmental water rights, and then the scenarios based upon that.
Okay. Got it. Thanks. Reggie, I think you're next, and then Jeannie.
Yeah, no, I think Cliff kind of spoke for me there. I think that this proposed bullet is just too vague, and I think that, as you mentioned, you know, it's provided to provoke discussion. I think that a good exercise would be to clarify and maybe hone in on a more specific statement of intent under that. Knowing that there could be multiple scenarios, knowing that I believe, or at least speaking for our organization, you know, if there is a diversion, we support a diversion as long as it meets, you know, our requirements, which we think are, you know, both feasible from the water supply and engineering analysis, which we've seen for, you know, really over 3 years now. And so, I mean, there's plenty of room to compromise there, but I think that specificity within that element would probably help this discussion. It may not, it may just complicate things impossibly, but I like the idea of trying to focus and creating this bullet point in a way that is more specific and kind of meets most of the goals for folks on this call.
So if I understand, you're suggesting that one step for a work group would be to come up with a different framing of what the assumption or what the assumptions are for the work around water rights. So, okay, I got you.
Right. I think that's well said.
Got it. Jeannie. Hi, Jeannie. Haven't talked for a while.
Takes me a while to drive and unmute.
Oh, no, don't say that.
Yeah, just actually everybody has fleshed this out very nicely. I think it is, while I don't disagree that is perhaps the assumption we should work toward, because why else is this group here if we're not looking for some kind of change? But it's rather important, I think, to frame an alternative where no diversion continues, because in order to understand the impacts and try to get funding for some of the projects that we're going to need, I think people need to understand the ramifications of no continued diversion on the economy, on the ag sector, and as mentioned earlier, on municipalities. I think that's really essential that we understand the magnitude of what will happen to the region without the continued diversion. So I think that needs to be analyzed as well.
Got it. Thanks, Jeannie. David, I think you're next, and then Terry.
I thought that the two basin solution team spent quite a bit of time running through a number of different scenarios with a number of different assumptions. I think they've analyzed this already, and they weren't able to complete it all because some of the studies weren't funded. But they had a lot of, I'm not saying they had a lot of time. They used a lot of time that I don't think we have. I think our timeline
Yes.
precludes a lot of study.
Yeah, and so David, though, are you, I mean, the comments to this point or the suggestions have been that more than one scenario should be looked at, and if I'm following, for different reasons. And what you're suggesting is that there may already be a good deal of work that would help that that effort as well. Is that right? Okay. All right. Terry. Terry, are you up? I'm not hearing anything. Are you on mute? I can see some video. Terry, I can't hear you. I don't think anyone else can at the moment. All right, I'm not sure what to do here, Jim, if we're having a technical difficulty, or if Terry's just having a
Yeah,
problem.
she just noted that she's having not able to unmute on her end.
Okay.
Terry, you
maybe
might try connecting by phone potentially.
Okay. So I think we've got, at least based on the comments that we've received, so some alignment that this slide and a reframing of the assumptions that would underlie the working group's efforts should be a task. That's what I'm hearing, and that acknowledging more than one scenario would actually be valuable for the planning committee, but that needs to be made explicit. And I think that some talking through by the people who may have done this could get you to just some adjustment in the language so that we have a basic assumption. This is a proposal for me. So this working group has a shared basic assumption about the basis for focusing and providing advice on water rights and water management. So that could be a task for the folks who are going to be working on this. So unless there's anything, this has been really helpful, and thank you for jumping in on this assumption. So we go to the next slide, Jim. So we had, and I think this sets up these discussion questions. We thought it would be helpful just to try and frame up some specific questions for you. And they may seem a little bit broad, but we get very specific by the end, including on what timeline. And this gets back to some of the earlier comments about how much time is actually available, and also, who's actually available to do the work that needs to be done within the timeline. And maybe you'll be building on work that's already been done, and there will be some obvious efficiencies or potential assignments there. But we wanted to go back to the broader question about how can this working group best support the goals of the forum. In other words, it's, again, not just a general discussion of water rights in the two basins, but what can this group do from your perspective that's really going to contribute value to the goals of the forum. And it's intended to be an open question, and then we'll get to what would the products be, or what could you draw on to develop the products to support what this group can do. It's sort of an existential question. Anyone want to start us off? Charlie, I see a hand up.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions for me is if a regional entity is going to, take over and manage a diversion, how that water will be allocated and sort of the costs and benefits of it, I think are a important question. In other words, someone's got to pay to maintain a diversion, and who will those parties be, and how will that water be, allocated to those parties? And then obviously the water rights associated with doing that.
Right. Okay. So that's where the water rights piece is. So what are the implications of that? Okay. Thanks for starting us off. David, your hand's up, and then please feel free others to.
I think the job one for us is to get a comprehensive summary of the existing water rights and their categorizations, priorities. If we don't do that, I don't know who would. There's lots of other things, but I think that's definitely a task for us.
And I'm curious, David, about how much of that exists. Is there any way to kind of ballpark it? Is it 50% of it?
I think most of it does exist, but I'm not sure it's in one place. And I'm not sure that there's a prioritization system across both basins. And that's where push is going to come to shove. That's not just going to be putting together spreadsheets, but sort of saying, okay, we have these precedents and these legal rights. I'm certainly not an expert in that prioritization, but I think that's going to be an area we need to weigh in on.
Okay. And let's see, Don, I see your hand, and then Dennis, if I've got the order right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Ryan Becerra did a really good job of summarizing that prioritization
Right.
last meeting, and so if folks want to look at that, they could go back to those notes. But that was already done by Ryan.
I guess one question might be then, is it to the level? I mean, to the level that would be add the value that the planning group and the rest of the forum need in order to make their recommendations. I'm sort of pulling together the question, and I don't know what Ryan intended. Is Ryan on today or not?
No, Ryan's away on vacation.
Can you imagine? But yeah, okay. He's taking vacation in July.
It was pretty. I would say the analysis was the summary was pretty concise.
Right, but the summary isn't. I don't think what is going to be needed. I think it's going to be literally at the level of a spreadsheet. On our side of this county, in Sonoma County, we've got 1,800 water rights. I think there's hundreds up in each of the other counties. There's the water rights in Lake County, right? There's stuff that hasn't been itemized down to the property level.
So Jim has just put the link to Ryan's 2-pager in there, and you're describing, David, a very detailed, as you said, spreadsheet level analysis or data, at least a presentation of those rights. So that's something to think about. Dennis, and then Reggie.
Yeah, John Nagel had done, in our 3 years of work with voluntary water sharing program, had done extensive analysis along with the water board for water rights that exist from the point of diversion downstream on the Russian River. And I'm sorry he's not here today, but there are some nuances within that, but a lot of that work has been done.
And Dennis, can you share in what format was that? Was it the kind of a very detailed spreadsheet? Excel?
It's in an Excel spreadsheet, and John could deliver that. The nuances are a lot of the rights are aggregated under, say, the Russian River Flood Control District or things like that, but it's all there.
Okay.
But I don't believe his work includes the water rights that will be affected by the dam removal and the other things that are being proposed.
No, it's
on the other
simply
side.
It's simply the current priority of water rights based on when the license was issued. So that analysis is there.
Right, but it only affects the diversion side. It doesn't affect the Eel River side, which their water rights are going to be affected in some ways too.
Correct,
I believe.
correct.
So it's potentially a piece of the puzzle. Okay. Reggie.
Yeah, I'm just, I guess I'm wondering, the question on what are the water rights associated with, I guess my question is, other than the water rights bundle associated with PG&E in the project, what water rights are you thinking about on the Eel River side? I know that's been mentioned a little bit here, and just questioning what the analysis needs to be on that element. I mean, we could catalog every single water right in both basins. I just wondered about the project effect of any scenario and what that would mean. If you want analysis of the Russian River and every element of every water right there, I'm just not sure the benefit you gain, and I think that the cost associated that would be pretty mind-boggling. But I mean, it could be done. It would just be done over, a course of years rather than a time frame that would fit this process. So I guess two questions: like, what are we trying to accomplish with the overall gathering of all the water rights? When I think we do have an effective analysis, as Don mentioned, of the diversion options that could exist, or non-diversion options exist, as they would apply to the immediate water rights in Lake Mendocino. And so I just don't understand the benefit of that piece of it. And then I was wondering if we could hear more specifically about the concerns on the water rights on the Eel River, possibly from David, if that's possible.
Okay, thanks, Reggie.
So I'm assuming I'm David.
We know you're the leading David so far today, David.
So my concern is that no matter what happens with the dams, when the dams change, then the water rights and the amount of curtailment that happens on the Eel River side in the summer is going to go way up, because you won't have a water supply feeding on a relatively continuous basis. Particularly those first few miles of the Eel River. Because the lack of flow, the river will run dry and some water rights will be affected. I don't know how far down, but it's not zero, right? There's that's my concern, that people on the Eel River side are going to be impacted, and if we don't consider them, I think that's we're selling ourselves short, in my opinion.
I appreciate that, David. I mean, I disagree with the fact of the dewatering. I don't think that's an accurate statement, but we can get into the specifics of that during a modeling exercise. And we have, in fact, because we looked at the fisheries analysis, which has flow analysis. I believe Scott McBain is actually working on the analysis there. It's always important to remember that the East Branch of the Russian River actually has a larger flow during the summer months than the actual Eel River itself. And so it's an important thing to consider moving forward. But I appreciate the interest in that piece of it. I just think the water rights holdings specifically on the Eel River are analyzed within the context of the PG&E holdings. That's the entirety of the difference. And then the water modeling associated with the eel is being analyzed. And so I think that is a good thing to put forward as far as the overall flow of the eel.
So I've heard two sort of big things that this group could do, big being a relative term. The first suggestion was to address how water would be allocated and who would pay, at least in the context of water rights and water management. And the second is to prepare a summary of all of the relevant water rights, however this group would perceive that. And it may be that there would be some areas of agreement and disagreement, and you could certainly articulate where the agreements are, and if there are some different perspectives that would need to be worked out long term, and the reasons why those exist, that could be another element of that product or that work. Have I captured those two accurately, those two suggestions for how the working group could support the water forum goals? And if not, let's get those clarified. And then are there other suggestions, because we can move on to some more concrete things if you've pretty quickly honed in on what this group could do. I'm gonna invite Frank to step in, and then we'll get back to Reggie. Frank.
I recognize that I'm, the absolute minority view here, but
Frank, would you actually let people know your affiliation? Just
yeah, I'm with the Lake Pillsbury Alliance.
okay.
There's, at least 450 property owners in and around the lake basin whose water is going to go away. So I would, there's got to be an acknowledgement of that. That's my only comment.
Thanks. Got it. Patrick Sullivan, your hand is up.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Patrick Sullivan, I'm the treasurer tax collector for Lake County, and I'm filling in for the supervisors who aren't able to attend today because of the board meeting. Just to expand on some of the concerns Frank raised, those are concerns that have been identified by the County of Lake, and I don't know if this is an appropriate forum to look into those any further. If the dam does end up being removed, the Scott Dam is removed, the county certainly has concerns about ensuring there's still water available for fire protection, about water available for the needs of the residents and the property owners that are up there. And we feel like there isn't really sufficient study about what happens when the lake does go away. And normally groundwater, the impact that it could have for groundwater up there, what the flows are going to be, and what the availability for that water is. So I don't know if this is the appropriate forum to discuss that, but also looking at some of the other groups, some of the other working groups, I don't know that it really fits anywhere else either.
So let me just suggest that, at least to capture this, a question that this group might address is, what are the water rights implications, if any, of what you're describing, both you and Frank, and so that it's not something that's overlooked, and people, that's a proposal for us to keep in mind as a third element here. Pam.
Good morning. Just in response to, I think it was Patrick, I already lost his name off my screen. I don't think that what you're asking about is appropriate for this particular group. Because this group is not going to address the impacts of Lake Pillsbury going away, if in fact it goes away, which sounds like it will, according to PG&E. That analysis that you're talking about in terms of impact for fire protection and residents' water supply around the lake needs to be done by PG&E as part of their decommissioning process. So it's not their license surrender and decommissioning process. It's not really a part of what this group is proposing to look at. And this group will have no control over PG&E's actions there. So we can talk to PG&E and tell them a lot of stuff, but that's going to be their action, not an action of this group.
All right, thank you. David, your hand's up.
I've got a question. I've forgotten who said it. I apologize, but there was discussion earlier about the need to assess the economic impacts or the economic costs and benefits of the diversion. Is that something, has anyone here checked with the finance and I think it's just called the finance working group? Is that something they're taking on, or is that has that fallen between the cracks and we need to take it on?
Yeah, I think there was a very early comment about how will the water be allocated and then who's going to pay for it. That's what you're referring to.
It's also just someone said offhandedly, the economic impacts of the diversion and its removal, or it's, if you were looking at alternative scenarios. And I didn't know if that's something that the other working group was actually going to be looking at, or is that something we really need to do ourselves?
Does anyone have any insight?
I could just jump in. Yeah, that as we've scoped it in the charter, the question of who would pay for things is in the economics and finance group, but also acknowledging that there's going to be need for conversations across working groups. So that might be something that this group works on in conversation with the economics and finance group.
So I recommend that we do that.
And David, I would also say that I don't think with the question of overall economic impacts is a separate question from the cost to water users.
Absolutely. I think that's something we need to make sure either we take that on and know that it's our responsibility soon, or we get the finance and economics guys to acknowledge it as theirs.
So is there any other input on the first bullet, this very general question about how can this work group best support the goals of the water forum? These questions were not questions that we put out in advance and gave you a month to think about. I want to acknowledge that. And so, Jim, I think that, and to everyone else, we may want to give people a chance to think about them briefly, but as others have pointed out, time is a constraint. Exactly how much time I don't have at my fingertips, but others of you have suggested that it really needs to be kept in mind as you're thinking about what you can do, what you're going to focus on. So I don't want to move too quickly, but if we've captured mainly what this group should focus on, understanding that people may have some contributions soon, maybe that are fermenting and that are distinct from what we've already talked about. Let's leave a little bit of space for that would be my suggestion, but understanding that we've got to keep moving forward. And I wonder if we could usefully then sort of shift gears. And we've touched on this a little bit, but there have been suggestions about what this working group should produce in terms of a deliverable. There's been reference to Ryan did the 2-pager that was available to everyone. And then it sounds like there have been other work done in other contexts, some analyses, there are some spreadsheets. But as you're thinking about the topics that we have discussed over the last few minutes, what actually could this work group, or ideally would this work group produce? Just quite realistically here. Is it a compilation? Is it more than every study that you can find or analysis of water rights, combined into a single document with tabs? Is it some sort of analysis that you would produce, referring to existing documents and also identifying gaps? What would actually be produced that would be useful and reflect the value that you would like, and also the time that is going to be required to produce something? And if you're on the planning group and you say, what do I know we need to have in order to do what we need to do? Maybe that's the best way to get at it. What would you like to have in front of you or available to you? Frank, or I just heard someone's not muted. Sorry, Frank. I don't see a hand up. So are people thinking about that? I mean, is the idea of if we take one of the examples of a very detailed spreadsheet analysis of water rights without committing yourself, is that something that you would justify the time that would be required potentially to pull it together? Reggie.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I I don't know. I think a few of us are coming at this from the perspective that we've been looking at this water rights and staring at the exact same water rights associated with the project for like 6 years now. And have like a pretty solid handle of like what they exist and what would need to be changed in order to get a, you know, plan that we'd support. And so from my perspective, I guess an education document that includes that information will be helpful. I just think it's been done successfully on something that I'd sign off on 3 times already. And so, I mean, I don't think the effort associated with putting together a new document is worth it, because I think Ryan's done a great job beyond that 2-pager and others have. And so I don't, I think there's a lot of, I think there's a fair amount of folks on this call that have done a deep dive. And so I don't know if we need to go through like that continued presentation or what the end goal should be. But information production, I don't think is a valuable piece just because we've done it.
Well, is it fair to say that there's somewhat asymmetrical familiarity with that water rights information? It sounds like Richie, you and some others have been living with this for a while, but is it true across the board for everyone who's participating here in the work group that there's equivalent comfort and familiarity with those water rights? I'm just testing this. You know, my experience is that when it comes down really to water rights and advising clients and making decisions, people tend to be conservative and want to actually look at it and look at the basic information, the core information. But I also appreciate that that's time consuming, and many of you may actually be quite familiar with it and comfortable with it. And you've already done a lot of that work, but is it everybody, or is it enough of you that you could say, we've basically got this? We could do some education. I think, Reggie, you suggested maybe there's an education step here to walk people through who may not be as familiar, but not spending a ton of resources developing yet another analysis. I don't know. I'm just trying to offer different dimensions and see what lands for people. David, your hand's up. And then
I'm just looping back to the earlier part of the conversation. I had thought that there was a idea of we needed to look at alternative scenarios. And I don't believe that if one of the alternatives is, hey, no more division, I don't believe anyone has said, here's who's going to be curtailed, and here's essentially who's going to be curtailed every year. There's been a general sense of that, but there's not a sense of, oh, well, you know, 30% of the water right holders are going to be high and dry, and that's going to be their future. I don't believe we understand that. Maybe I'm uninformed, but I thought I read everything the TBS put out.
A question, okay. And Reggie, your hand's up, and I see Kristen's hand is up as well.
Sorry, that was just a vestigial hand right there.
Okay, it's a message. So Kristen. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
Great. How are you?
Good. So I'm Kristen Peer. I work closely with Brian Becerra, representing Sonoma Water. I just wanted to add to the conversation. This was something that came up in the initial technical briefing, but it was a question about what is the sort of, for lack of a better way to describe it, the color of the water coming down the system. So what Ryan did, I think, was really talk about the sources and the rights associated with them. But I think it was Beth Simone who raised this a couple of times, which is people don't necessarily understand what the molecule of water is coming down the river. And so that might be, and I think that speaks to your question too, David, which is who's going to be curtailed? What are the scenarios? What does it look like in the future? And so perhaps looking at, different scenarios, identifying the color of the water coming down the system so that people understand, what their rights are and are not, might be a useful exercise going forward.
Right. Food for thought.
Not sure what color of the water coming down means, Christian. Can you say it a different way?
Yeah, I think it's so, Ryan walked through the various sort of the sources of the water in the Upper Russian, which are natural flow, PVP imports, that sort of thing. But I think as your downstream water right user, you're not necessarily sure what water is in the river. Is it coming from the eel? Is it coming from natural flow? And the water right is dependent on what type of flow is in the system. And so I think the idea is identifying different scenarios of what water would be in the system and who has rights to those is not necessarily clear.
Did that answer your question, Vivian?
Yes, the source of the different waters in your water right.
That's right.
Thanks, Kristen. Other thoughts or perspectives on useful products? In addition to refining the description of the assumptions that we had talked about earlier. Yes, Pam.
So maybe it would be helpful for folks. Personally, I think it would be best. I agree with Reggie that it would be best for this group to spend their time trying to get water rights holders and even non-water right holders, whether they're on the eel or Russian, to understand how water rights work, at least under the current state water board framework, the California framework. But I think the idea, what Kristen was just talking about, which is sort of an extension of that, and educating people on what water is available under what circumstances. It's also, I think, something that we could at least look at two scenarios on that. And one of those being that the proposed diversion continues, and one being that the proposed that the diversion does not continue, and making that abundantly clear to people. So I think if we're going to talk about scenarios, those are the two scenarios we should be talking about. And if we can, we refer to it, as Kristen said, as coloring the water. So in other words, explaining what water is there at what times, and who has a legal right to it and who does not have a legal right to it. That would be helpful. I just want to point out that we need, if we're going to be doing this, it needs to be done quickly. PG&E is moving, and we don't have 2 years to do this work. So I just want to point that out to this group. I think the simpler we can make it, the better. I think trying to put a spreadsheet together with literally thousands of water rights in it is not going to work. People know, hopefully, approximately the date of their water right, and they're going to have to work from that. So I view it as a little bit higher level than getting down to the every individual water right level. I don't think we can do that, not in the time frame we have.
Thanks, Pam. So part of the challenge would be to find what is that right level, right? So that you are giving enough detail that the people who you really want to educate or to help understand can understand, without just saying, just scratching their heads, right? Or saying,
That's right.
It's not
Yeah,
clear
and I
enough,
think
yeah.
that was one of the purposes and goals of the forum was to educate. And I think that's, in the case of water rights, I think that's probably their major goal as far as the forum goes, is to
Mhm.
educate, because it's just, people just don't understand it, so.
And then in picking up on some previous, and I'm just sort of putting this out there, to the extent that there's, you want as much alignment or agreement as possible on what would be presented in such a document. And then if there are different views about some things, you would identify what those are as well. If that is the case, I'm not assuming that it is or it isn't.
Sure.
Okay. Elizabeth, was your hand up next, and then Matt?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I had my name in there, but my picture shows I'm the general manager for the Russian River Flood Control District. So building on what Pam was just saying, I would further that, if that's the direction we decide to go as a group, I would further it in being very clear about what this continued diversion option looks like. I think there's a lot of confusion still out there about whether it will look like it does now or it will look very drastically different. And secondly, to make sure to include the discussion of storage rights, particularly what water rights are legally able to store and redivert water from Lake Mendocino. That's going to be very impactful in the future for Russian River water users.
Got it. Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, wow, great minds. I was going to make the same point that Beth just made in her first point, which is like, it is a question. Do we know? We're speaking in terms of like a diversion continuous scenario, but it seems to me there's a lot of different things that could look like, and I don't know the extent to which we have kind of a scenario in mind that would have broad support, or if there's how much work there is to do on that front. So I guess, or even that we should be looking at just two scenarios. Like there might be more. I just wanted to make that point. So I strongly agree with that. I hadn't actually thought earlier of that second point about storage. I just, as long as I'm off of mute here, I'll say I strongly support that as well. It seems like a really logical thing to have in the mix as well. That's all.
So Matt, just so I could follow up there. So are you saying that it's not crystal clear to you what the scenario would be, the continued diversion scenario would be, and that is going to need some conversation as it relates to a water rights perspective? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how much water is going to come over when, and so how's that going to be determined through what processes, what's out there, what changes might have to be made or would have to be made. There's ESA considerations there. There's certainly water rights considerations, beneficial use, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of things that got to go into that. And so, I think most folks I know on the or a lot of folks on the EL side are open to continued diversion, but I don't always hear consensus on like how much water can come over when. And then there's a whole physical aspect to that too, like what's possible to divert when. And so I just wondering if just based on what I've heard in the past, it's not clear to me if there's agreement like on the one scenario to rule them all, for a continued diversion, or if that's something that needs some more work. That's all.
Okay. Pam, your hand's up.
Yeah, I agree with Matt that there hasn't been necessarily a landing on what that diversion may eventually look like, because there is still work being done. But we don't have time to wait for that work to get done, is my point. My point is that we know what was developed during the ad hoc work with Congressman Huffman. That's a place to start. And then the no diversion scenario is another place to start. And I don't think we can sit around and wait for that other work to be done. PG&E is talking about releasing a sort of admin draft in November. So this group isn't certainly going to develop that information. So I think we need to pick something that may not be completely accurate in the end, but at least it'll give some people an idea of, level of magnitude at least. So I would hope that this group could move forward without having all the answers, or else the group's not going to be able to move forward at all.
And I just want to make clear, my hand back up, I don't disagree with that. I think that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure we understand, there could be some uncertainty there. And but I agree with the urgency and the need to move forward rapidly if that's going to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I
and let's
totally
just-
agree with the uncertainty, Matt. Totally.
Yeah, totally. I think we're saying the same thing. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, it's kind of like I'm not suggesting you would do this, but you'd sort of have to kind of have a feel for the sensitivity of it, right? If the scenario you assume isn't exactly what may emerge, like how far off are you going to be, right? And because it's important to educate people and promote understanding, and I think that you all, people in this group probably have a really good feel for this if you sat down, but you would have to ask yourself that question. As Pam is, as part of what Pam is suggesting. So, I'm sitting here thinking, so what would a product be? And maybe others of you are as well. And I know we're moving very quickly, and this needs a little bit of time, but I'm also hearing from people we don't have a lot of time, relatively. So keep a little bit of the pressure on and recognizing that we've got 15 more minutes. But I guess if I'm envisioning a product, you would so clean up the language on the two assumptions, and then based on that, the proposal would potentially be to sort of maybe build on Ryan's memo and fill it out or restructure it to actually identify the categories of water or the sources of water that would be available under those two different scenarios at different times of year, and find the right level of detail. And in doing that, you would be identifying basically this is where there's a consensus. I mean, we're comfortable putting this out there, and here's where there are some differences in views, and here's the reasons why, and these things would need to be chased down. How does that sound? I'm not asking for a vote. Is that aligned with maybe what you're thinking, at least at this point, or some of you? Because I do want to be testing this, because we're going to be asking some people to start doing some work here. So how does that sound? David, your hand's up.
I think that we need to have an output that is, as a work product, essentially PowerPoint level, and that compares and contrasts our, let's say there's two scenarios, just to continue the sentence, our two scenarios, and just showing here's what column A looks like, here's what column B looks like, to make it pretty clear to the planning group, but also to other organizations we want to educate. Here's what our alternatives are, and this is our favorite alternative in terms of the impact on water rights. We obviously, other people will have other perspectives, but in terms of just water rights, which is our domain, we need to have a stated preference. And let's say that's a 20-page PowerPoint. God forbid it's longer than that, but having something that was informative, but also made clear the alternatives.
Well, it's less than 50 slides, which that's admirable, David. So good for you. And so you're suggesting a higher level of detail, and also really focusing on the content and not asking people to spend a lot of time on drafting at this point a document, but really the analysis and the presentation.
I think we absolutely need to build on what's there. There's going to be a lot of time involved with reading for someone who's working on this who hasn't read all the stuff. But even finding, there's 4,000 pages of documents, even finding the reference for, oh yeah, here's a fact, that will take some effort.
Got it. Okay. So a higher level, sort of presentation level product, given time constraints and other factors. So why don't we, I think we've got 11 minutes, Jim, before we need to go into the closed session. any feeling for a timeline and also for who might do this work? I would ask people to consider whether they're able to volunteer today. We don't, I think everyone's realistic enough to know that asking 25 people to all get together at the same time to actually develop or dig in or come up with a work plan. I think the idea might be to get a smaller group of people together who were authorized and informed and could efficiently do this and not do it, but sort of lead the way and be checking back with this bigger group and a sort of consistent transparency and access, but knowing that because there is a limited amount of time, although I don't have a date, a smaller group of people who maybe have a command of the information and are willing and authorized to do it could together maybe come up with a product that this larger group can react to, contribute to, and inform that's a model for doing things. So there are people who, I don't know how that sounds to you, but if it makes sense, we'd need to at least get some initial volunteers and think about what a timeline would be. And Jim, could I just ask you, do you have a sense of if we're asking people, when we need to have a deliverable product, which means it has been really discussed, vetted in this group to then be able to forward it. Do we have a sense of that for folks?
Well, I would say that, Pam mentioned earlier the PG&E looking to have a administrative draft released by November. So that would seem to be an important deadline. And yeah, I think others on the call may be able to comment that they're, sooner than that would probably be ideal.
Right. Anyone else have any input about timeline? Because that will probably inform who might be available to do the work. Or are we just going to give it to Ryan once he comes back from vacation because he's on vacation and you know what happens? So we can think about that option. Phil, your hand's up.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. This is Phil Williams, Special Counsel for the City of Ukiah. On this point, I would observe, I understand the timeline we're operating under. I would counsel my colleagues here that, time is a resource that we can either spend wisely or not. In terms of when a product may be due, I have some just structural concerns and would advise all of us to look to the planning group for direction in terms of what work and what product and under what time constraints that product needs to be delivered. I'm always a little concerned when lawyers are driving the train. You have really good people that are very smart, that are very eager to solve all of the world's problems, when sometimes the principals just may need a more discrete problem to solve. So I don't know if there's a way to integrate the planning group leadership and get real clear direction from the planning group to provide instructions to the working group. And my thought is once we had that direction, then we could start making decisions about how to allocate resources, understanding what resources the working group has available to it, including what kind of water rights background work has already been done. We can go back to the planning group with a deliverable.
Got it.
And I'm not trying to punt here. I understand that that's a little bit of a punt. I'm not trying to do that and delay further, but going forward as this group gets going, which I think we can start necessary movement, but there needs to be some integration with the planning group to make sure that we're not solving a problem that the planning group doesn't actually want us or need us to solve.
Fair enough. Any thoughts? And I don't feel like you're punting. It's wise to, when you're thinking about resources, to think about how you're going to spend them. So I get what you're saying, and I'll just keep nudging, right? And we can make this work. Jim, do you have any thoughts about that? Are there any planning group members here who have? We haven't convened a meeting of the planning group. I don't know when the planning group meets again to tee up a conversation, Jim. So any thoughts?
Yeah, the planning group meets next Thursday, August 3rd. So we could certainly put that on this question on the agenda for that meeting.
Okay. And Beth, your hand's up.
Yeah, Phil, I hear you and I appreciate the thought. I would say there's probably, it feels like there's enough representation of the planning group here with the various interests, unless anyone's like highly objecting that we move forward. And what are we moving forward on? And what I think of is that as a public servant, my biggest concern is that individual water right holders, whether they be for a public agency, a private water company, or an individual farmer, etc., do not understand. They don't have access to the information, or they don't know they need to find. They don't know what they don't know about the changes that are coming. The ones that we are pretty certain that are going to happen, and the ones that are being proposed, for example. So finding a baseline that we could agree on. Well, we know this much is going to happen. And providing this as an educational tool to those water right holders. But that, I mean, that's a huge can of worms, because how do we reach them? How do we get, you can drag a horse, but you can't make it read the document. So I guess I'm still a little bit unclear about what this product is going to do other than that.
Yeah, and maybe, so Beth, is that a reason to tee this up as a discussion by the planning committee? I mean, the planning group, is that what
Yeah,
you're
I don't see any
suggesting?
objection. I don't have any objection to bringing it to the planning group next week, for sure. But I think if there's somebody eager to get started on something for the working group to react to, that'd be great too.
Tom Johnson? Tom, are you on mute? I can't hear you. I see your hand up. Having a technical difficulty there? Oh, Tom's saying he needs to be unmuted, Jim.
I don't believe that I have him muted. Yeah, Tom,
Tom, if
it's
you're the
showing it.
916, he may be the 916 number. If you are that 916 number, Tom, you are muted on the phone.
I see. Thank you, Pam.
Okay, yes, thank you. Thank you, Pam.
How are you?
Hi, Mike. Long time no talk to you. Sorry about the technical ineptitude there. Tom Johnson for IWPC. I wanted to mirror and echo what Beth said, because I think she was spot on. The water rights themselves and particularly the water use associated with a couple of thousand appropriative and riparian and various other types of water rights on the Russian side will be impossible to untangle in a timely way. There's also not comprehensive data. Some of those people don't file use reports and so forth. So that's just gathering up the water rights won't be that helpful. It also doesn't address some of the other beneficiaries. The Russian River would do groundwater recharge. Anyone who has a well in the ground wouldn't necessarily have a water right, and yet they benefit from the additional water that comes through the diversion. And so I think my suggestion would be that whether you wait for the planning group or not, what's needed is a fairly simple educational piece that if you take 50 or 60,000 acre feet that's currently coming to the Russian River and that no longer occurs, then the impacts will be substantial for quite a while until whatever other measures might be able to be put back in place. There may be some ways to guesstimate what some of those impacts might be. For example, I think earlier someone stated that Lake Mendocino will go dry more often. And everyone knows what that looks like because it just happened in the past couple of years. Other things may be a little bit more amorphous, but trying to craft the message using best available, incomplete, but best available information is something that I think could be started on immediately and is probably overdue already. Whether someone wants to leap up and take that on, that's a different question, but that would be my friendly amendment to what's been said so far. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm mindful of our time here, and I know we've covered a lot of ground. It may be premature to ask for volunteers when we're not exactly sure what we're going to have people doing. But at this, I guess what unless a group of you or a few people want to say, look, there's enough there. It makes sense to go to the planning group and get tee this up as Jim suggested next Thursday. But that's another week, and when maybe some things could be done. But do you feel like you know enough or have heard enough today that directionally, at least, you could have some practical conversations just among a small group of people? I don't know that we can fairly ask to sort of form a work group because other people may be willing, but they just need a little more clarity about what it is that they would be doing before they could be authorized to do that. So, the two outcomes today are, I think there is enough to get some reframing of that slide. And if anyone wants to volunteer to work with Kearns and West to just reframe the assumptions so that we can tee up two assumptions, it makes sense to me that we would get a next version of that put together. And I think if we just had a couple of people to run it past, and if you wanted to volunteer to do that, that would be great. And we could get your input and circulate it to this group. The second thing would be to have a conversation in the planning group. And I think the question is, I think we need to frame the question as, well, what is it do you want the work group, the water rights work group to focus on? I think we can tell them what has been proposed or the ideas that have been proposed, the suggestions that an extremely detailed water rights analysis doesn't seem to be what's needed here, that something at a higher level that would be useful for educational and other purposes, that would identify where the agreements are, as well as where there's any disagreements and the reasons why, using two different scenarios, understanding that the scenarios aren't necessarily perfect. I would tee something like that up. I'm just thinking about the conversation, Jim, and then see what the reaction is in the planning group. Like, is that what the planning group wants? Is that what the planning group thinks is going to be useful? And see what comes back. And then based on that, we would want to convene this group again pretty quickly and get to work. So that's my proposal. How does that sound to people? I know it's a little rushed. We do have to have this closed session discussion about co-chairs, but how does that sound to people as a general set of next steps? Yes, Pam, your hand's up.
Yeah, I at first I thought you were going to say just go ask them what they want, and which I think is a really bad idea.
No, I wouldn't.
You need to, that you corrected, you shifted, and
Yeah.
I do think that we need to go with them and tell them what we think we should be doing and get their blessing.
Yeah.
And open, just wide open, and what do you want us to do is not going to work.
Got it. We probably get that advice from all of you. Phil, your hand's up.
Yeah, Mike, I agree with what you said. And I'll also observe, I think, if we're about to go make some decisions about co-chair leadership, and that's a great opportunity for whoever those co-chairs are to start providing some structure and direction as we engage with the planning group.
Good point. Okay. Anyone else? Jim, do we have enough sort of guidance if anyone feels like this is the wrong way to go at it? Please feel free to speak up now, but I think this is where we'll directionally, if you're comfortable, we'll see what comes back from the planning group. We will go into closed session here and identify some co-chairs and have the benefit of their sort of co-chair participation here going forward as well.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. All right, I know it's been freewheeling and pretty quick, and we still have some open questions, but I hope this has helped move us a little bit, and look forward to speaking with you all again after the planning group meets. We're going to ask the public to leave so that we've got the work group members, and remember this all flows through the planning group. You know, so I think that is the request at this point. I don't really know how to provide more clarity about staying or not participating. It really is whether what has come from the planning group. And Jim, if you have more clarification, let me know. So I think we'll end this meeting of the work group. We'll let everybody know when we're going to be meeting again, and convene in closed session, which really means if you're in the work group, stay on, and public can leave. The planning group meeting, as Jim said, is the 3rd.
I believe we're good to go here, Mike.
Okay, great. And I don't know if any of you are in other work groups, and Jim can review the process in other work groups for identifying co-chairs. You want to do that, Jim? There's not a whole lot of rules, but here are the proposed co-chair responsibilities, just so you know what you might be getting into if you're volunteering someone else or yourself. So you'd be working with Kearns and West to plan the work group meeting agendas and to coordinate with presenters. You know, there's been some discussion about coordination across working group and planning group, and we need some help with that. Planning group report outs, communicate with work group members as needed. You know, I think that particularly in this group, there's going to be a need to do some work between meetings. So we look to co-chairs to be doing that. And our goal is to have consistent co-chair responsibilities. And, you know, to that end, co-chairs are not expected to be decision makers or to actually to lead the working group meetings. That's the role for Kearns and West, but it's really all about coordination